What time is it? Okay, hello, welcome everybody. I see people are joining. So welcome to this webinar where we're launching the data lab. Let's see, perhaps another minute, some more people join. Let's see if we just find a critical mass. Yeah. Yeah, I think we're there. So let's start because we have a really busy agenda as always with the VCI events. So first of all, thanks a lot for being with us today. So today we're going to launch this output from the data lab, and we're going to explain you also a little bit about the VCI, how we work. But most importantly, we are going to hear from different people. So yeah, let's just go and give a brief intro to the VCI because perhaps there's a lot of people in this call that are not familiar to the VCI and the work that we do. So basically, the VCI, we are a practitioner forum where we focus on scope 3. So we have more than 130 leading organizations as members. And yeah, basically we explore all the topics about scope 3 and the operationalization of this, particularly, in light of all the recent developments between the different standards. Now, some of our members are very sector specific. So, for example, from food and ag, also from apparel, we have some members. We have a lot of members, for example, that are service providers or also platforms that are involved on the decarbonizations of different sectors. So, yeah, we are a very diverse. We have a very diverse membership, I would say. And yeah, that's the VCI. Now, today we have a very packed agenda, as I mentioned. So we are going to have a brief welcome and a short introduction of what is this lab and also what are the labs in general for the VCI. And then we're going to have a short opening words from Benjamin Vilgos. And then, of course, we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of the output, right? So my colleague Mustafa is going to give a brief opening context on the output, and then I'm going to give you a high-level overview of the overall document, what is in there, what can you find, etc. And then we're going to hear from some of our members that were part of this exploration, some of the opinions on, how this output has been or can be leveraged and other thoughts and insights. And then we're going to do a quick closing on this. Now, also, please help me welcome the speakers today. So we have a lot of people today in the call, which is great because we're going to hear a lot of different perspectives from the VCI team. As I mentioned, my colleague Mustafa Gamaluddin is going to be co-hosting the session today. Benjamin Vilgos from WRI Europe, he's going to give a brief opening to this session. And then, of course, at the end of the session, as I mentioned, we're going to hear from Doug Cornell from Farmers Edge, Jeff Seal from Habiterre, and Daniel Kim from Mars, some of the insights and some of the learnings that they had during the process. And just briefly, again, because there are some people that might not be completely familiar with the VCI lab. So basically, when you join the VCI, you become a member and you have the right to be part of these processes, right? The VCI labs, they are more innovation focused because we know that there are a lot of topics, in particularly in climate action, scope 3, that are still nascent. So we open the door to many of these discussions here, and we also bring experts because, of course, in VCI, we know a little bit about the scope 3, but we also recognize that we need to learn from other topics. So in the past, we have had, for example, the systems lab that went a little bit on the whole ecosystem for scope 3 and with some implications on traceability, etc., etc. Then, for example, we had the claims lab as well. After the systems lab, and then the last lab that we have had, and the one that we're presenting the output today, is the data lab, where we are exploring the metrics that are adjacent to carbon, right? And we recently kicked off the mission factor lab, which already we hosted the first session already, but that's also going to be a lab that will bring really good methodologies and insights for all the community on Scope 3. And then I just want to thank all the participants of this lab. So as you see, some of the members were part of this process. Again, very diverse membership, because we understand that the labs also, they present forward-looking perspectives. It's very much trying to anticipate changes, to anticipate different things that are coming. So thank you to all the members of the lab. And just the last thing that I'm going to tell you today, just a brief overview of the topics that we explore on this lab. And later, my colleague Mustafa is going to talk a little bit more in depth about this. But basically, this lab, we focus on 4 key metrics: no deforestation, land use change, land tracking metrics, and freshwater. And what we did is that we just focus on certain things that we commonly explore on the greenhouse gas emissions and Scope 3. So, for example, how do you measure this? How do you measure? What do you verify? How do you collect data? What are the challenges, etc.? And of course, the methodologies. We were very lucky because we were able to get some of the real experts that are developing all the methodologies in these different metrics, in these different fields, to be in the lab, to teach us about what they are doing, to also talk about the complexity that they are addressing, to tell a little bit about the different tools that are being used at this point. And also, during the last session, we tried to do a little bit of consolidation. Now, today, also, we want to thank a lot all the speakers during the lab, because we got, and especially, as I mentioned, the labs are open, and we bring external guest speakers, etc. So we had a lot of the different teams from WRI that are working on the methodologies. We also had examples from McDonald's, from Unilever, from Primark, from OFI. And then we also have Claremont bringing the perspective from the investor, for example, and then from the accountability accelerator as well. We had a little bit kind of the overall view from the environmental perspective, right? So just to bring it back also on the higher level. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Benjamin Bielgosz, who is a friend of the VCI, and is going to give us some opening remarks. So, Benjamin, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So my apologies in advance. I've had some Wi-Fi difficulties, so if you have a bit of background noise off my mic, I apologize. But my name is Ben Bielgosz. I'm with World Resource Institute, which probably many people on this call are familiar with, and WRI participates in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the Science-Based Target Initiative, SBTN, CDP, so an accountability framework. So I'm just going to kind of quickly run through, if the controls are working, a bit of our data in this space and kind of our role, which we're generally working between academic researchers and corporate supply chains that involve export commodities. So I'm assuming a lot of you on this call represent one of those two or something tangential to it. And what we tend to be doing is putting out global kind of standard and peer-reviewed data sets that can basically help companies or NGOs or other stakeholders like certifiers kind of do the basic work to quickly report on deforestation metrics, land use change emissions, land rights, and water risk. So to give you a brief idea of what that looks like in this space from WRI, some of the kind of open data resources we put out there, because we have an open data mandate, so everything we do has to be published, peer reviewed, and then made accessible to everyone. We have about something like 35 data sets available via Global Forest Watch, and if you want Creative Commons or corporate use licensing of that open data, then a lot of people go to us through Global Forest Watch Pro, which kind of gives you scalable enterprise data access via API. what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about in the next couple minutes, because I think it's probably where all of your heads are at, is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sector Removal Guidance. And that's been delayed for many years due to the alignment challenges of getting an entire kind of land sector to agree how to do it. But we have some open results for emissions factors for 44 commodities. And these are being published kind of over the summer, first as just tabular results, and then in the fall, I think they'll be formalized as peer-reviewed on our open data portal. But generally, the reason we take this approach is that, when you're aligning stakeholders for the entire sector, you want something transparent, reproducible, accessible to everyone, so that, let's say you don't have some stakeholders who can use it and others who can't afford to. And then we tend to support through a variety of partnerships, kind of commercial adoption through service providers, and making it generally scalable through the kind of big partnerships that I talked to when I was opening up. So just to kind of set the stage, what we've been working on with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and with a number of the big LCA companies is to come up with kind of what we anticipate being the common methodological ground for how to do either direct land use change or statistical land use change, or what's kind of coming up now as an intermediate solution, which is jurisdictional DLUC, meaning that if you know where every single soybean is being grown in a particular jurisdiction, then you have something it's kind of like direct land use change, but it covers the entire sourcing area. And so we're publishing this year kind of around the same time that the official land sector removal guidance will come out, some of the open data values for that. And what those will look like will be kind of emissions factors for these 44 core commodities. We haven't covered livestock products because those are a bit more complex, so that we're looking at that for next year. But these are for things like soy, cocoa, palm, maize, rice, anything that you would normally go to FALStat or EcoInvent for a country stat. We'll be able to give you an emissions factor for your land use change for that agricultural commodity as just an open tabular result. So the idea would be that then that will enable a lot more stakeholders to quickly and easily do simple land use change calculations. So if you just know I have 8,000 tons of soybeans coming from this particular jurisdiction, then you'd be able to quickly and easily get an idea of what your scope 3 emissions were for that volume of product. But I'm thinking, not being familiar with all the stakeholders on the call, that we're going to hear about more detailed and granular approaches. So this is kind of our open data gambit, so that everyone can do it at a pretty simple entry level. So
Thank you.
I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
And the same should be viable for many of those other domains, but I think the emissions factors are the part that's most salient to this, the value chain initiative.
Thank you, Ben. And it's also great to hear how all this data is now available. And also is for us, it's also an invitation for all companies, because we know now it's a little bit complicated. Also, methodologies are being developed, and also some of the tools are also being built as we speak. But it's great to know that there is more things available for all companies to be able to report, at least up to a certain level. And then, then I will give the word to my colleague Mustafa.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Silvana, and thanks a lot, Ben, for this opening remarks and context. And I would like to expand a little bit on the context before diving into the content of the output. I want to first situate it in the right context. So just flipping the slide. Yeah, perfect. So the Data Lab outputs to start with, I want to clear out that it builds on the VCI Guidance 1.1 that was released in 2021. And the Data Lab output serves as a cross-sector addendum, and its purpose is to support companies in broadening the scope of impact measurement, acknowledging the interlinkages between carbon, land, and water systems. And as expectations evolve, particularly from frameworks like the ones Ben mentioned, of course, the GHGP and the LSRG, SBTN, and even mandatory frameworks like the CSRD. There's a growing recognition that environmental integrity relies on a more comprehensive set of metrics. And so that said, this output presents an overview of the current methodologies, tools, and sources to estimate those metrics, a review of complexities and challenges, and more importantly, it explores potential pathways for a consolidated MRV approach. And as we explore the outcomes of the lab, one of the fundamental questions we asked was, why is it important to integrate these land tracking and water metrics now? The answer starts with the recognition that meeting the 1.5-degree target requires more than just reducing carbon, right? It calls for a broader, more holistic lens, one that really understands the interconnectedness across environmental systems. So first, we look at synergies and efficiencies, since we already now have a little bit of maturity and strong MRV systems in place for carbon. So by building on this infrastructure, we can more efficiently extend these systems to track also other metrics without starting from scratch. And secondly, it gives a holistic approach. Land and water systems are not separate from greenhouse gas emissions. They are deeply interlinked. So recognizing these relationships strengthens transparency, fosters trust, and can accelerate collaboration across the value chain. And also looking at those metrics support future-proofing and informed decision-making as the regulatory landscape rapidly evolves, underscoring the importance of proactive data-driven actions. Right. Now, looking at this slide, we see how climate, land, and water system really intersect across the corporate value chain. The top of the chart is the real-world outcome that we're aiming at, so climate and systemic impact. And this is the ultimate goal of our collective action. And then from there, we have the strategic supply chain mapping and risk assessments to intervention, design, and implementation. These metrics are tied to sourcing decisions, certified commodities, and MRV systems. So by following this full cycle from data collection all the way through to reporting and impact assessments, we can understand the systemic effects of interventions. And from there, we see how this data feeds or plugs into reporting structure. We see Scope 3 inventory data now includes inputs like direct land use change, deforestation status, and land occupation. Optional elements like the carbon opportunity cost, all of them can also be considered within those reporting structures, depending on frameworks and also ambitions. And we also increasingly see water metrics are being integrated into reporting. Now, let's look at how these metrics relate to specifically the GHGP's LSRG. Under the common guidance, companies will now need to account for specific land and water metrics in order to credibly report Scope 3 emissions and removals. This will include also tracking land use change, particularly, for example, conversions between forest to croplands. Also would require reporting on land management emissions, as an example, fertilizer application or livestock methane, and then also quantifying removals from practices like afforestation or soil carbon enhancements. And while water is not a core GHG category in the LSRG, it is really emphasized through its linkage to land activities and recommending companies to track water use and water body impacts and water management practices. This supports identifying also the trade-offs and co-benefits across impact areas by also integrating water metrics. So while these may seem like distinct pieces kind of stacked up together, they're really part of an integrated approach to understanding emissions, removals, and also resource use, especially in the context of land. To expand a little bit now how this work aligns with other frameworks also shaping the corporate reporting and environmental accountability today. Besides the LSRG, we also, as Ben mentioned earlier, the SBTN, which builds really on the SBTi's foundation for climate action, but now also expands the scope significantly to include also nature-related goals, covering topics under land use, biodiversity, freshwater, and even ocean health. We see also CDP, platforms that has long been a key disclosure platform and now also includes land and water as part of its assessment of risks, impacts, and also mitigation practices and strategies. It aligns also closely with other frameworks like the TCFD and also the GHGP, of course. GRI standards, also remain another go-to for ESG disclosure, linking operational activities with sustainability commitments. Also, we see the TNFD, which focuses on nature-related risk management. So really asking companies to assess, manage, and disclose impacts and dependencies on nature. And then we have also under the regulatory umbrella, we have some EU regulations ahead of us. So the EUDR on deforestation. We also see the CRCF, which sets quality criteria for land-based removals. And finally, of course, the CSRD, which would mandate robust digital reporting under topics including also land and water, as we see ESRS, E3, and E4. So what we're seeing here in the frameworks landscape, that we're seeing a convergence really around integrated nature inclusive accounting, which emphasizes the urgency and relevance also of the metrics explored in this lab. And with that, I would like to hand it over again to Silvana to dive into the overview and highlights and the content of the Data Lab output. Over to you, Silvana.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. And also, I don't know, like Ben, there are some questions coming in the Q&A. So please also, if you can answer to those, if you can type some answers, and we can also take some questions at the end of the presentation. Well, I'm going to give you a brief overview, but also I don't want, I mean, we're not going to go completely into the details because as we mentioned, so normally we are not the experts on this, but we try to make a high level overview on different things, particularly in the output for all the people that are interested on these topics to see what are the relations and try to have a high level understanding of the different implications of the different metrics, right? So again, what we did and what you will find in this output, so basically we have organized it in there are 6 chapters, but there are like, in reality, there are 4 parts, right? So of course, the background to not only talk about the process itself, but also a brief introduction on all the things that are happening now in the context and why we are focusing on this data lab this year. And then chapter 2 is the chapter that has the most or is the most meaty one, I would say. It has all the information about the different metrics that we explore, and we have a common sort of framework to explore these metrics. And again, we try to make it very simple explanation so everybody can understand this without, having a little bit of a nervous breakdown because of the complexity. So we try to connect them, try to also explain some of the complexities of this and also some of the implications, for example, for the methodology, etc. We also include a couple of chapters to capture some of the learnings, but also the consolidation the types of consolidations that we explore. And the last section was focused on the conclusions and also kind of the call to action as well that came out of these discussions. So that's what you will find in the document that you can download. And then let's just go quickly through the different metrics that we included. And again, we're not going to go very much into the detail, but what is important is just to understand why are we looking at these metrics from the scope 3 perspective, right? So the first one that we included was no deforestation. So we know that no deforestation is not the metric per se. The no deforestation is basically just to track that there is no gross deforestation of natural forests due to sourcing or production, but we also know that there are some related concepts. So, for example, the conversion, DCF, etc. The reason why it's important is because at the end of the day, deforestation is what influences or impacts the most on the flag sector, right? So everything. I mean, it's very simple, right? So if we don't have trees, then it impacts the carbon stocks. It impacts all the processes that we have, all the emissions, etc. What was interesting also is to see, for example, the different ways in which no deforestation was tracked at this point. And everything has to do a lot on the traceability that is enabled for the different products that we're trying to claim this no deforestation. So, for example, we can measure with, for example, if we prove that we have very good traceability, and then we can ensure that there is no deforestation to these farms, but we can also leverage some of these certificate, for example, for commodities. What is interesting also, or we also discussed several times, is that sometimes the certificates, and also these sustainability certifications, they do not necessarily comply with the requirements that the LSRG is asking for, right? So it would be good to just have a bit of an understanding of what are these requirements, say for land use change. Now, let's also talk a little bit then about land use change, which is just basically the transition from one use to another in land. So I think that the part that is relevant for us are the emissions that come out of that transition, right? And again, these are very important because it makes a huge impact on the scope 3, particularly category 1, when we are talking about these goods. And that's why it's important to also understand. Now, land use change has some complexity, as Mustafa said, like it's going to be required to report as well in the land sector removal guidance. There are different types of land use change, direct land use change, when there is site-specific information and there's statistical land use change, right? So we included a little bit of the description on the methodologies for both, but again, at the end of the day, for us, is just try to understand which is the relation between all these different metrics. So for example, here we can say that at the end of the day, if we can define that there is no land use change, for example, then we can claim that there are no emissions out of this land use change, and there is a threshold of 20 years, and then if a cut-off date, and then if there is some land use change, then we have to start accounting in a certain way, and this is all explained in the land sector removal guidance as well, right? So we are starting to make the connections there with the greenhouse gas accounting for scope 3. Then land occupation and carbon opportunity cost. So these are land tracking metrics, and they are not completely new, but these are especially interesting because they bring more or less the big picture, right? So it's about how much land or what is the amount of area that is being impacted by the production of this of the different commodities, for example, and then just to understand how can companies go for more efficient production models, right? So the idea is to have a higher intensification to allow that as much as possible the land can remain without deforestation, and that can capture and has the carbon stocks that they are ideal, right? So for us, when they were explaining these metrics, particularly, it's interesting because they provide a different dimension, right? So it's not so much about reporting, but also this can help also companies to make decisions on a higher level. In terms of the methodologies for these metrics, then it's not so much based on direct measurements because there are some data that you have to consult in some tools, etc. So it's could be with some indirect data sources, but it's interesting to have these insights and to know how you can leverage this type of metrics going forward. And then the last one, which is freshwater or water. So we included this because, of course, water management and water stewardship and management and water footprints, they have been there for a little bit longer than carbon, for example. So for us, it was interesting to bring water, not only for the connection between scope 3 and water, but also because we saw that there could be some learnings. Now, the part that is very interesting about freshwater is that it's very localized, right? Because we're actually talking about watersheds or basins, etc. So they bring this local dimension, whereas with carbon, at the end of the day, we have these footprints on a higher scale sometimes. Oh, no. And okay, we know that you need to have certain traceability to a farm, but at the end, how companies report how this is understood is on a very kind of global level, right? So for us, this was an interesting insight to see in the interaction with water. Also, during the lab, we had a presentation from one of our companies, our member companies, that presented how they see water in relation to scope 3. And in certain sectors, this is a very key relation because, of course, to move water, you need energy, and energy, that means scope 3, right? So it was also very interesting to see how that is taken for decision making again, and also to see which are the interventions that could render benefits on different dimensions. So just after, exploring the different metrics in the lab, what we did is that we explored some potential pathways for consolidation. And of course, being the VCI, we tried to go into different solutions that we are trying for scope 3, or that we see that they are finding some way in scope 3. So first of all, we said, well, why consolidation? Because consolidation is going to allow companies to make better decisions on their investment, and also to reach efficiencies in how they collect data, how they understand the data, etc. Because if you are collecting all this data, it has to help. It is not only to disclose and report and say, hey, this is how good I'm doing. It's to plan, right? What's the next step? Where are you going to invest, etc. So ideally, that's also the idea behind consolidation, that these metrics and any other type of information that you would have from supply sheds there, or from your sourcing from your supply chains itself, that they are being smart, right? So with this consolidation, what we saw, well, basically, now with LSRG, there are some requirements. There are some requirements, for example, in terms of traceability. And the idea is, if companies can comply with these requirements in traceability and also other requirements that are there, the idea is, can we have a lecture of this of the different sourcing regions or supply sheds and report, and that would be recommended because that is better to make decisions for procurement, for example. If that is not in place, ideally, or a solution that we have explored, particularly in connection to scope 3, is leveraging these market-based mechanisms. As we mentioned, and we saw a lot about this, particularly with no deforestation and land use change, that's a great solution, but also there's a bit of work to do, because we really need to understand what these different market-based mechanisms require in order to allow us to leverage them to report on this data particularly, right? So we need to see if the methodology is aligned, if we need to see if the data complies with the requirements, etc., etc. And then what the other pathway, and I think this is pretty much what happens with less consolidation, is that based on all the disclosures that you need to do or to comply to, you start picking up your key your KPIs, and then you build up from there your strategy. So I think that at the end of the day, for companies, this is a little bit of a combination of everything. But and in general, kind of the recommendation and where we landed, what you're going to find in the output is particularly this vision for the supply shed as well, for the sourcing region, to help companies to understand. So first, to build these efficient strategies for data collection, interpretation, etc., but also to make better decisions in investments and in interventions. Then what is next? And of course, from the VCI side, for us, we're going to keep on bringing this work also. We would like to invite also companies to test, to apply, to give us some feedback. But ideally, we want to keep this knowledge that we have today to apply it on as we move forward with different sectorial work that we have. So for example, in terms of the market-based mechanisms, we want to bring this question on all these different data that are being now also required for disclosure. How can we make sure that they complement all this information that we have for scope 3, right? So this harmonization as well with the standards, particularly now that there are so many things in flux. We also want to continue the alignment with the standards, knowing that this is not only about greenhouse gas emissions, but we also need to start collecting all these different data and finding the efficiencies and the opportunities there. Also, of course, as always, promote collaboration. And also we have started collaborating more, for example, with different organizations that are more focused on land use change and all these different environmental metrics, because it's important that we have the high level vision and that we have feedback from other fields. And of course, from the VCI particularly, we aim to continue building capacity with different members together, learning and striving for this innovation that we find in the labs. Lastly, just to mention, so I have a couple of things more to say. Well, but basically, again, as we mentioned, we saw this very timely because, as you know, the land sector removal guidance is going to come out soon. And in the land sector removal guidance, some of these metrics are already required, if not all, right? So some are optional, etc. But the idea is that this is coming, right? So we need to report on that. And for us, what we know is that this document is not, it's a living document. It captures what we know today. It captures about the methodologies, the things that are under development, the things that are already explored, and that also, as the standards continue to evolve and continue to bring different dimensions, then the whole body of work will expand, right? For now, we aim to serve, particularly this release of the land sector removal guidance, and to help companies to understand better all these different things that are going to be required as well. And lastly, of course, our call to action today. So please, we ask you to download the document, read it, give us feedback, but also start trying to have this bigger picture, trying to understand, this reading on the supply chain level or the sourcing region level, because we do foresee a point where we have an agile way of going with the net zero value chains, right? So we are going to follow the discussions also throughout the different work streams, sectorial work streams, but also, as we mentioned, we have another lab already. So for sure, a lot of these topics will come back again. I think that's it from my side. So I think if there are other questions open, and also to Ben as well, that already introduced some of the things.
Thanks, Sylvain. I see that we already have Ben almost answering all of the questions. Want to maybe pause for a second here if there are any additional questions from the audience, to please put it in the Q&A box. Also, if you have any questions regarding the content of the output and the presentation that Silvana just made, please feel free to type them in, and afterward I'll be happy to welcome our guest speakers to hear some of their reflections and takeaways from this lab series. We have a question coming in. I'm just going to read it out loud. Consolidated reporting and management of timelines for targets, updates, and progress reporting. We greatly appreciate it across the industry. Too many competing timelines and requests today.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's more a comment, so we can also publish it. But yeah, yes, we think so, and we know that like even within greenhouse gas, right? So not to mention about all these different metrics, but even for example, the different disclosure frameworks that are there, we know. Right. So for us, that's one of the important points that we want to bring forward, and to say, well, this is important that we bring the harmonization in some of the aspects of Scope 3, but also the harmonization with these things that are adjacent to Scope 3, right? So these are immediate. Also, for example, when we were designing the lab, we know that from members, there was a request to also include biodiversity, which is another completely it's another level of complexity, for example, but it's very important to understand how this all comes together, because a lot of these interventions that are focused on regenerative agriculture, etc. I mean, at the end of the day, you need to connect all these dots, and you need to track, and you need to make the most of it, right? So it's yeah, we keep it in mind, and we will also try to champion this in the different forums where we're active.
Yeah, agreed, and I second that. And maybe we can take another question live, and then we'll be happy to also continue answering the questions in the Q&A. Just a question from Zach on other also metrics that could also be relevant, such as biodiversity, NOx and SOx, particulate matters, PFAs, and water storage. And the question is whether any of those were considered for inclusion. Answer. So yeah, maybe just I will get back to you, Savannah, but maybe just to, since I have the microphone, but as we presented earlier, the idea behind launching also the Data Lab Explorations was also to cater to the upcoming regulations, particularly focusing on the requirements for the LSRG, the GHGP, and also the other reporting frameworks that also consider land-based emissions, removals, and also water metrics in the coming regulatory frameworks, whether the voluntary ones as we mentioned, as CDP, but also regulatory ones like CSRD, all of which kind of also reference the GHGP and LSRG. So that was kind of the focus of the lab, but of course, all those metrics are definitely also relevant, and to actually continue the work that we started with the data lab, looking at things from a holistic perspective and looking at environmental metrics in conjunction with each other rather than in silos is definitely what we would also vouch for and encourage.
Right. I think we can move on,
Yeah.
right?
I would say we can go ahead, and also if the questions keep on coming, we'll also be happy as panelists to answer them. And yeah, now I would like to welcome our first guest speaker, Doug Cornell from Farmer's Edge, to share his reflections and insights on the lab process.
Hi,
On to you, Doug.
thanks so much for the introduction, Mustafa, and thanks so much to the group here, Silvana, for reaching out and asking for a few comments. We appreciate the highlight as a company, and we've been involved in the VCI process for several years now, and I guess my comment is we got involved and stay here. Myself and our sustainability manager, Jessica Bocek, we make our best efforts to come here and make sure we're up to date on what I think of as the alphabet soup of the sustainability area. Just going through this and looking at all the short forms we use and actually starting to understand many of them at a little deeper level as part of being part of this. The other big part of this is just these interactions and the interactions in person. Those are very valuable to anybody in this space. I think particularly us as a service organization. So we're quite interested in staying here and learning about these pieces. In particular, I think as an organization that has spent much of our career or much of our 20 years working directly with growers and building out systems for assisting growers, we've built quite a warehouse of data and also of ways to get the data into a platform. And as we've evolved and turned more to being a service enterprise for B2B partners in this space, CPGs, processing plants, crop input manufacturers, and so on, ag retailers, crop insurance. So as we've worked in those spaces, we've learned to use those tools to address this. And so this lab in particular, I found of interest, first to interact on some of these pieces that are, some of these frameworks are that are getting more clear, but especially because sort of 3 out of the 4 of these areas are kind of more in our wheelhouse as being an organization that has spent years figuring out how to handle all the land information and how to collect that information from growers. And so as we look at no deforestation, I mean, we're active in that space in Brazil, creating reports for ag lenders who want to monitor what's going on with all their lending portfolio across a lot of growers. And so, we already layer some of this data in there. And so it was interesting just to see the pieces of this come together and the framework to explain it, because we launched into some of these areas and had to build those pieces and discover those ourselves. And this is just a great summary. This lab has been a great summary of those pieces and a document to refer to. As I reviewed that document, I looked through down there, and we've just signed a contract for doing EUDR for soybeans out of North America by a grain handler and tracking, using our satellite imagery to help track the soybeans and know where they're from. And so that's just one piece. Another piece in this portfolio of answering these questions on no deforestation and what does that mean to me as an ethanol plant, and why do I have to collect this information for ICSS into Europe or into California or exports into Canada even for the CFR. So all this is just building over time. And having this focal group to work on that is just great. So we've been leveraging some of those pieces. We've now got a real good framework in this document to leverage more of those pieces. And as we have these discussions with our various partners and it doesn't stop at scope 3. I mean, it's valuable in our CI scoring space and just in our data traceability and handling of, okay, we got the data from the grower. How do we hand that down the value chain and work with scope 3 partners to get this accomplished? So that keeps us very excited about continuing to go on in this space. And for us, next steps is to just keep working on solving these pieces and smoothing this, integrating with other systems. We need to amp up what we're doing in the waterfront. We've dealt with irrigation data, but the watershed data and water quality data is not a space we've worked in. So we'll look to collaborate on that front. But yeah, it's very interesting, very valuable to us, and we've enjoyed it to date. That's my comments, Silvally or Mustafa.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Doug. Yeah, great work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing with us, and we're happy to see also the operationalization of the concepts explored in the lab also, and how it trickles down into your day-to-day operations and also the things that you're planning ahead as well. So thanks a lot for sharing that with us. And now I'd like to give the word to Jeff Seal from Habitari to also share the insights and key takeaways as well.
Hey everyone. First of all, thanks to Silvana and the team for having us to participate today. For those that don't know, Habitare might actually be the newest member of the VCI, although I've been participating along in my previous roles for quite a long time. And so it's always a good time to interact with the folks in the VCI and really try to push the envelope of where things are going. And I think when I think about this lab, for me, it's one of the first opportunities for us to think more holistically. I think in the space that we operate in, this environmental, impact space, we often are too siloed. It's like, oh, we put all the carbon people over here and we think about soil organic carbon, and we stick all the biodiversity people over here to think about that. The land use change people that think about that. And so this was really an interesting opportunity to start to bring those people together and try to break down those silos and think about how the work that we do is really connected. And how do we bring those diverse, connected impacts together in more of a systems approach? Now, that said, trying to do these individual metrics is hard enough as it is. And there are lots of challenges to that. So, it seems maybe like we're going to add to our difficulties by start to connecting them in a systems approach. But we need to really think about how these one set of metrics impacts another set, right? I mean, when we think about the work that we do, particularly in the agriculture and the food space, the impacts on land and water really connect across all of the planetary boundaries, and we're pushing the planetary boundaries as it is. But because of all of those things are so connected, our thinking also needs to be interconnected like that. And so, I think that's really the challenge. Coming from sort of the MRV space, the thing that I really thought about in pulling together thoughts around this guidance and this work was in the metric space. Really, I think the challenge for these, we sort of like hit some of the low-hanging fruit at the beginning. And now we're at a place where we're starting to think about things like biodiversity that, I don't know how to define it. I can tell you what it is when I see it, but trying to like quantify that becomes a challenge. And so I think one of the things that we have to be really careful about as we start to bring in these other metrics and how they're connected is like we really have to be good at defining what they are. It's like I can't really measure something until you can tell me exactly what it is I'm measuring. And so I think that's one of the key challenges that we need to think about in this space. And coming up with I had this conversation just yesterday. It's like coming up with a fuzzy definition of a metric comes up with a fuzzy way of trying to determine what it is. And then once you get into these fuzzy ways of measuring things, then you bring lots of criticisms about, well, is this good enough or this doesn't meet the standards? And so I think, I really challenge people to be very, very precise about how we define these metrics. But once we define them, then I think the next real challenge is in the measurement space, right? And like, how do we come up with ways to measure those outcomes? And I think the challenge there becomes letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. We run into that all of the time, right? It's like, what is practical, I think, in the measurement space, what is actionable, to really be able to make progress. It's too often we look at guidance or how we're supposed to do things, and we just throw our hands up and say we can't do it. And that's really not acceptable given where we're at. It's approaching our goals. And so, I guess like the last thing I would say is, really focus on how these things are interconnected. They're complex, but we have to figure them out and we have to get them right. And so, it's forums like this that really allow us to like broaden our thinking across the sectors to really help to bring these challenges to bear. And we really appreciate the opportunity. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Jeff. Thank you for sharing, particularly the challenges, because the process is definitely not without challenges. So thanks for sharing that. And with that, I give the word to Danielle King from Mars to also share their insights and key takeaways also from their perspective as well as participants in the lab. To you, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Mustafa. I'll try and keep my comments pretty brief, recognizing we're coming up on time. Similar to the other panelists, I first want to just thank our hosts. This was my first time participating in a data lab, and it is a lot of content. So I really appreciate not only the facilitating, but also documenting all the outputs and discussion. I know it's a lot of work. So a few things already kind of touched on by the other panelists, but I think first, as we clearly saw going through this series, there's a major need for better alignment, reduction of this proliferation in standards, tools, regulations. I think that was touched on in some of the Q&A as well. The proliferation, I think, helps in some ways, but hinders in others, right? It can start to be difficult to cut through the noise, and at some point, I think, starts to almost feel like it detracts from some of the effort on the ground, right? We're putting a lot of effort into measuring, which is important, but need to also keep in mind that we're trying to have impact on the ground. And so I think that constant evolution in standards and frameworks can almost feel like a moving target that we're kind of constantly trying to keep up with. And so I think this was a good reminder that there are a lot of people working on this and that we're moving in the right direction. So it might not be as quick as we want, but we're moving in the right direction. And then also kind of seconding a comment just made by Jeff, I think this was also a great reminder that these metrics are complex. Our environment is complex. We're still working to define a lot of these metrics individually, never mind in a system. We're also working to measure a lot of things regarding supply chains, which are very dynamic. So that adds another level of complexity. And I think that can also lead us to become very siloed. So for example, in my work at Mars, I focused a lot on forest and land use, and a lot of the content in the water session was either an overdue refresher or was new for me. And so I think just this further highlighted for me the importance of bringing people together to break some of that down. I think it's natural to become very technical and siloed, but important to find these sort of opportunities. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on, a big thing for us from the lab, key takeaway was that we really need to continue advocating for the application of market-based mechanisms and supply shed approaches, not solely for emissions, but across environmental attributes like deforestation, conversion-free, and water. The lack of alignment that we see around traceability and chain of custody, it's inefficient, it introduces additional complications and doesn't really make a lot of sense. So at least for Mars, we really appreciate VCI's leadership in these conversations and see organizations like VCI as critical to helping actors in the space overcome these barriers to action and also help us ensure that we're spending or investing our climate-related funding wisely and getting the best impact. And then I'll put a link in the chat, but to plug some recent work we did over at Mars with market-based solutions. We have a strategy for tripling our renewable electricity procurement by 2030 through our Scope 3 value chain. So I'll share a link in the chat. But it begs the question, what if we could do that for other metrics like water and DCF? And then moreover, how do we do that credibly? So how can we apply these other approaches credibly for other metrics? And then just in closing, before turning it back over to our hosts, really, I think my biggest takeaway from the lab experience is pretty optimistic. I think it's fair to get frustrated as we're sitting siloed, crunching the numbers and trying to work through definitions. But we also need to take a step back and realize and appreciate, I think, how far we've come and how far this space has come in terms of transparency, information, and alignment. We're kind of building the plane while it's in flight, or building the ship while it's in transit, or whatever that saying is. And so I think we can get frustrated, but it's important to also take a step back and just recognize how far we've come. And I'm excited to see where this conversation is in 2 years or 4 years, right? And what we're tackling. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you again so much for our hosts and for
Yeah.
the lab sessions.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks a lot, Danielle, for ending it on such a positive note. I also, iterate and second that. Definitely, there is no denying on how far we've come, also as practitioners and professionals in this space. And yeah, let's keep the conversation going. And for today, we just want to bring some closing remarks before we send each other off. So just a quick reminder again, the report is now available for download through the link through the QR code that you can scan over here, or through the website, of course, and we encourage you to read, share, and build on it. And we'd like to also bring a bit of reminders on our work streams that are currently active. If you are already a VCI member, you can, of course, have access to our emission factor lab, our latest lab series, which is open for all members. The next session takes place in July 15 on supply shed emission factors. So look out for that. And yeah, if you are interested to join, if you are not a member, please reach out. Lastly, if you would like to become a member and you are not, to join our sectoral working groups, we are currently recruiting for the upcoming Food and Agriculture Working Group set to start in November 2025. And also we have our apparel and footwear sectoral working group, which already launched last month and aims to run up until September 2025. And yeah, that was it from our end today. We hope you engage with the output, and you also thanks again for our speakers for bringing such rich and valuable insights, and see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.